8 years ago, 9 years ago, I began to notice a very disturbing pattern. And that pattern was familiar. And when the 2016 campaign began in 2015, the very first announcement sent shivers up my spine because I recognized what was happening. And that was the newly announced candidate was dehumanizing and demonizing groups of people and essentially provoking fear, which is a powerful motivator. And I began to worry that the pattern is that would escalate. And I began to document the dehumanization of groups, immigrants, Muslims, others, the demonization of opponents or critics or the news media, the delegitimization of rivals and institutions. And I began to compare it to prior incidents of violence. And what I concluded is, historically, there are 12 forms of language that have historically preceded escalation of violence, including to genocide. And it begins with dehumanization, demonization, delegitimization. It also attributes violent motive. It also scapegoats whole groups of people. And the pattern is people become accustomed to seeing people as the other. And that leads first to just incivility, the normalization of incivility. Then it leads to exclusion of certain groups. Then it leads to random acts of violence against members of those groups or people perceived to be members of those groups. Then it leads to intentional hate crimes against members of those groups. And then it leads to individual acts of terrorism against symbolic targets. And then it leads to collective acts of violence and terrorism against symbolic targets. And then it escalates from there. And I spent, and my researchers spent, a fair amount of time documenting these. We saw all 12 of those forms of language used in Mein Kampf and in the run-up to the Holocaust. We saw all 12 of those being used in the massacres at Srebrenica. And we saw 10 of those 12 used in the massacre of Rwandan Tutsi by the Hutu. I then began to compare it to the American political system, and I found that same demonization and dehumanization was being done in American politics.